Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel and the series where I, a writer, talk about movies about writers. What I want to do with these videos going forward is to do a beginning part where I'm kind of general, no spoilers, and then I'll let you know when I move into the end part where I go much more in depth with all the spoilers. But that being said, I actually don't think it's all that possible to spoil the movie I'm going to be talking about today, because it's about a piece of literature which, according to Wikipedia at least, is like, you know, a great piece of American literature. So that kind of tells you how the movie's going to end. But I'm going to do my best. So let us get on to discussing Howl, the 2011 movie starring James Franco, which is about the poem Howl written by Allen Ginsberg in the 1950s. The poem was written in a couple of sections, and the movie is broken up to follow these sections, so each section of the poem is addressed independently. Within each section we get to see a live reading of the poem by the author on a small stage, black and white setting with people smoking, people in the audience reacting to what he's saying. These scenes of him reading are then blended into very, very colourful animated visuals where someone has created an artistic interpretation of the text. From this reading and presentation of a section of the poem, we are then taken to an interview with the author at some point in the future where he's talking about his influences and his creative process. And then we also see his publisher in court being accused of publishing obscenity, essentially. And in that courtroom, we get to see experts be questioned about each section of the poem. Some of those experts don't like the poem, don't think it has any literary merit or value, and others do. And we get one expert per section of the poem. Because of this format of focusing on one section at a time, having the initial here is the piece, enjoy it as it is, followed by a discussion of the word choices, the literary merit, the influences, etc. Watching this movie really did feel like being back in my literary theory class at university. Like, I really can't describe it any other way. Through the interview scenes, we get an insight into the author's creative process. He starts off by talking about how he had to move away from the type of poetry that his father wrote and would approve of, poetry which relied really heavily on rhyming structures, and move into a place of writing from greater honesty and without the belief that anyone would read it. In order to write Howl, he had to believe that his father would never read it, that it would never be published, and so what he said didn't matter. He also talks about how the casual, colloquial conversations that you have with friends are the most interesting, and that these should lead to the most interesting writing rather than trying to be super formal in your writing. And he talks about having to approach his muse as a friend that you would have these colloquial, casual conversations with. He also says that writers struggle because they approach writing with these preconceived notions of what their craft ought to be, and that as a consequence they exclude the possibility of pursuing these more interesting casual routes, which would allow them to write as they are, which is what he has done in writing Howl. Through the courtroom scenes, we see this approach to writing being assessed by the expert witnesses. They talk about form that is expected within a literary piece and whether or not the poem Howl adheres to those definitions. And they discuss whether the colloquial or casual language that's used is appropriate. At one point it's asked whether the poem could have been written without the use of certain words which are considered obscene and offensive. And they talk about whether the poem can be understood. They're repeatedly asked, can you interpret this piece? Do you understand what this is meaning? And they offer their own interpretations. I'm going to get a little bit more into specifics now, so if you want to avoid spoilers, this is the time to go, and I'll see you next time. For those of you who are staying though, I have to ask you to ignore the costume change. Now, just a teeny tiny trigger warning for homophobia and conversion therapy. These things are not discussed in extensive detail or presented on camera in a graphic way, but they are nonetheless there, so take care of you. The interview scenes with Allen Ginsberg and the flashbacks that we get to see into his earlier life show us his experience of coming out in the 1950s and his sort of awkward tentative attempts to start relationships with the men that he meets and how those relationships go. These relationships are woven into Howl, particularly his relationship with Carl Solomon, a young man that he meets when he is institutionalized following a run-in with the law where he's given the option of prison or asylum, because, you know, those things are the same. He doesn't go into great detail about his experience in the mental institution, but he does talk about Carl Solomon being subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. Again, this isn't something that's shown in great detail on camera, but we do get sort of a brief glimpse. He says that he's eventually released because he promises the therapist that he will live as a heterosexual from then on. And this experience affects him in a really fundamental way. He talks about struggling with who he is and trying to be heterosexual. And again, these things are woven into Howl. The courtroom scenes really annoyed me to begin with, because understandably, because it is based on real events that occurred in the 1950s, but still, only one of the 4 expert witnesses is a woman, and she doesn't see value in the poem. She talks about how it makes you feel like you're in the gutter when you read that sort of thing, and how it lacks any kind of form or style that is required for something to be of literary merit. And then the, you know, good guy defense completely dismisses her, which is just so frustrating. And then you're like, just have to think about historical context. The next 2 expert witnesses are both supportive of Howl. One of them, when questioned as to the poem's form and structure, says that it does have those things and that it's using a, hang on, where is it? Jazz phraseology. I don't know anything about jazz, so I can't comment on that. And when questioned as to the use of colloquial language, or, you know, swear words or offensive language in the poem, he says that he thinks that euphemisms would have felt dishonest to the author. He also talks about how the literary value of a piece is dependent on whether or not it will withstand the test of time. He says, I'm having to refer to my notes here because it's a bit wordy, that the trial will draw attention to the poem. Howl perhaps will have a wider readership than it might otherwise have had, and go down in history as a stepping stone along the way to greater or lesser liberty in permitting of poems of its type. And I was just like, oh, yes. Like, obviously, but also just like, I don't know. For those of you who are not already aware of this, censorship is something that I feel very strongly about. The trial ends and the court finds in favour of the publisher, and here we are today with the book still readily available. This outcome should have surprised no one who is familiar with American literature. Remember when I said at the beginning it was hard to kind of spoil this movie? That's why. That's pretty much all the spoilers I had. So that's kind of the movie. It's just a literary discussion about a poem framed within the context of a court case and interviews with the author, and mishmashed together with readings of the poem and this sort of fantastical animated interpretation of it. It really does just feel like a literary conversation. For that reason, I don't think it would appeal to that wider viewership. I think if you enjoy literary discussions, you'll probably enjoy this movie, but you know, you'll have to listen to James Franco talk a lot, and that definitely means it loses points for me. If you've enjoyed this video, maybe consider giving it a like, and if you're new around here, do hit subscribe and ring that bell so you can stay up to date, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Oh, and if you have a suggestion for a movie you'd like me to review next, leave it in the comments below. There is a tiny fly. You may catch it flying around. I've been trying to kill it all day.